Well, before I tell you that I was born in India, that I just did, I have to tell you why, and that means telling you a little bit about my father, who was born in Dorchester, a suburb of Boston, on a 100-acre estate. And when he was 12 years old, he heard a church sermon that convinced him that he should become a missionary doctor. So he had the traditional Bostonian education, classic Boston Latin School, Harvard, and Harvard Med School, after which he was sent to Madras, South India, as a doctor to work with an elderly doctor who was in failing health. That was in 1921. So he met my mother there, and they married out there. In the plains, it could get kind of hot in South India. That's 9 degrees north latitude. So they would take a little vacation for a month in my father's case, and 2 or 3 months in my mother's, to the nearby hills, 7,000 foot altitude. And that's where I was born in 1932. Back on the plains, we lived in a large house close to Dad's new hospital, brick and mortar. It had electricity, but no running water, which meant also no flush toilets. And the living room was like 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. The house had 15 or maybe 17-foot ceilings because of the heat. Doors were open most of the time. Because both of my parents were supposed to be full-time missionaries, they had servants who cooked the meals and cleaned the house and emptied the toilets and basically took care of everything, planted the garden and weeded the garden. We slept under the stars, protected by mosquito netting, and when it rained, we could roll our beds under the roof. When I was 6 years old, my parents were due for a sabbatical, so the 6 of us, I was the 4th of 4 boys born to them. So we had a family of 6, and we went to the United States, Auburndale, a suburb of Boston, and that's where I had my first grade. Back in Cody, the hill station where I was born, I joined my 3 older brothers in a boarding school, Cody School. There's something to be said for being raised with your peers. I was 7 years old then. Instead of under your parents, and you're raised by your parents, they have to impose restrictions to lessen the friction between adults and children. And when you're in a boarding school, you're living with your peers and you don't have those restrictions. Of course, you have other restrictions, but there's something to be said for that. And if you're interested in that, you can read about it in a book by A.S. Neal called Summerhill, A Radical Approach to Child Rearing, and it's in the library here. Much later, when we went to college, we were astonished at the puerile behavior of some of our college classmates who were away from home for the first time in their lives. We had long since grown out of the locker room talk and so on in Cody. Okay, Cody School was started in 1901 as a school for American missionary children. During the war, a lot of the American families left and went back to America. We were one of the few families that stayed, and Cody School's clientele. Besides the Americans, we had quite a few British and some German students, and a lot of the people there were from diplomatic families or from business families, as well as from missionary families. Now we had a few Indian students, but not very many. Now it's an international school with probably a majority being Indian students. 1946 was when my third brother graduated from high school, the two others having already left for the United States in college. But 1946, my parents were due for another sabbatical. So the four of us, my third brother and me and my parents, went back to India, to the United States for a year. So I spent my 10th grade in the United States in a nearby high school to Newton High as a suburb of Boston. I was back in Cody School for the second half of my junior year. I learned playing geometry on the boat going back by myself, and I was there for my 12th grade. After which, I enrolled in Oberlin College. Well, why Oberlin? The reason Oberlin, in Cody, I had become pretty much the school, the student pianist of the school. I accompanied choir rehearsals, and I accompanied the hymn sings, which meant that I had to be able to play on the spot any hymn in the hymn book. And I was interested in music. My crowning glory came in my graduation ceremonies, which we had at night, during which the power went off. So the student who was reading her paper couldn't go on, and I was next on the list, so I got up and went to the piano and found that in spite of the mistakes that I made playing the Warsaw Concerto, I had rousing applause in the dark after I was done. Okay, so went to Oberlin and played the piano there just for myself, and took a half year of organ lessons to find out what the difference was between playing the piano and playing the organ. I'm going to take a minute here to just review my shipboard travels. 1938, when I was 6 years old, as you know, the family took a P&O line from Bombay to London. We were a week in London sightseeing, and then took the Queen Mary to New York. And for 5 nights on the Queen Mary, this 6-year-old saw Walt Disney's new animated movie, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, each night for 5 nights of the trip. That was fun. That was 1938. Okay, 1939, we went back to India the same way we'd come, on the Queen Mary to England, and a week in England, and then P&O line to Bombay. 1946 was the next time my parents came to the United States. That was just after the war had ended. So we were on a troop ship from Calcutta to San Francisco, Pacific instead of Atlantic this time. My father and my brother and I were in a cabin with 110 men. My mother was in a smaller cabin with maybe half a dozen women, and we traveled to San Francisco from Calcutta and went across to Boston on a sleeper car train. Okay, at Oberlin, I was, let's see, at Oberlin in those days, all the men ate in women's dorms. Each women's dorm had a kitchen and a dining room, and we had family-style meals with waiters in the dorms. I waited tables as part of my scholarship type money for tuition, and became the head waiter there. And that was where I met Allison when I was a senior and she was a freshman. And a year later, we became engaged, but we agreed that we would not marry until after she had graduated from college. Before I graduated from college, Kodak visited, interviewed me, and offered me a job, a summer job, which I accepted. So I went straight from graduating from college to Oberlin to Kodak, to Rochester. And I liked the summer job enough, so I canceled my plans to enroll in the University of Wisconsin for graduate school and stayed at Kodak. 10 months later, in the following spring, I found the draft breathing down my neck. And so I didn't want to be drafted, so I enlisted in the Navy's Officer Candidate School. And when I graduated as an officer, as a naval officer, I was assigned to an airborne early warning squadron in Patuxent River, Maryland, which is only 65 miles from my fiance's home in the suburb of Baltimore. That was pretty easy life in the Navy. I didn't have a whole lot to do at my desk because we had to have enough people in the squadron to take care of the airplanes and fly them and do training exercises, which we did. I did 6 3-week training exercises in that as an officer in the naval squadron. 3 weeks each in Naples twice, in Naples, Italy, in Nice, France, in Barcelona, Spain, in Morocco, in Argentia, Newfoundland. And even that was pretty much vacation, because the first week of those 3 weeks, all the senior officers met with shipboard officers to plan the exercises, and us junior officers were free to sightsee and be on the town. We also had to have 2 airplanes and 2 full crews in case one airplane was incapacitated for any reason, which meant that when my airplane wasn't on training exercises for the second week, say, I was free as to do anything I wanted. So what it meant was that 2 out of those 3 weeks, we junior officers were on vacation. Very nice. In addition to that, well, when we weren't on vacation, when we were flying, that 1 week when we were flying on training exercises, we were up at 5:30 in the morning and out over usually the Mediterranean, working with ships. But we were always back home in time for dinner and the night on the town. And while the shipboard officers were having to stand mid-watch or do whatever other duties they had, so we had an easy life. In addition to that, because we were flying, we had hazardous duty pay in addition to our regular pay. Okay, my last year or so in the Navy, I was transferred to teach shipboard stuff at a shipboard training place in Navy installation in Charleston, South Carolina. I was teaching shipboard stuff, having never in my life been afloat on a Navy ship. I chose to teach nautical rules of the road. So that worked out well. We enjoyed Charleston, and by that time, Allison and I were married, and we took our cat on a camping trip leave for 2 or 3 weeks from Charleston to New Orleans and down the west coast of Florida to Key West, and a short stop in the Everglades and back up to Charleston. Okay, I left the Navy, went back to Kodak, and back in Kodak I was assigned to a classified job. Classified, why? Because I was calculating satellite orbit. Now, this was in 1957. You have to understand that most people had never heard of or thought of satellites. It was before the first Russian Sputnik had gone up, so that's why it was classified. After 3 years doing that, I was offered a transfer to they needed a mathematician at the Kodak Research Labs, and they offered me that job, and I took it. Back in the research labs, I was researching Hamiltonian optics for the first part, and then I became in charge of the division's computers, big computers. It was when Kodak was trying to downsize, much later in the 80s, that I found myself with a very good offer from Kodak, along with everybody else, not just me, for early retirement and a full year of pay after retirement. Because I had come to Kodak straight out of college, not even my 4 years in the Navy detracted from my Kodak stint, and I was eligible to retire at the age of 54 and did so. I taught for 13 years as an adjunct professor at MCC and at RIT. At MCC, I taught pre-calculus and then advanced calculus, and just for a couple of years, I think, and maybe less than that. And then I went to the computer science department in RIT, where I taught Fortran, which was still going strong, and COBOL, and systems design and database design. So that worked out well too. When Allison, in the meantime, was working full-time as a librarian in branch libraries in Rochester, and when she retired in 2001, I quit my teaching. So that was the end of my career as a teacher. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about our family. You've already met Laura on the screen here, and Laura and Bob are both members of the First Unitarian Church. They live about a mile from where we live. Laura's an artist. You can check her out on laurawilder.com. You are familiar, no doubt, for quite a few summers, seeing her artwork in a big display in front of the hanging above the stage in the auditorium. I don't know if it's going to be hanging there this summer. Of course, church is not in session yet, but we'll see. Chris is our son, working for Allstate Insurance. Senior moment there. Working for Allstate Insurance close to New York City. And Roger is a jazz pianist in Kansas City. His wife is the head librarian at a library for a chiropractic institute. He plays jazz piano and works for the Kansas University. Okay, let's see, what else? Church? Well, when Laura was old enough, so we thought we ought to introduce her to a religion, we checked out the First Unitarian Church, and we joined in 1985 when Bob West was minister. So Allison is prompting me from behind. 1965, Bob West is minister. One of my first jobs was as music committee chair. And when the music committee had something to request of the board, I, as spokesperson, went to a board meeting, and when I entered the room, the board erupted in laughter at some joke. And John Parker, who was president at the time, took a vote. When the vote was over, he said, "Don, you have just been appointed to fill a vacancy on the Board of Trustees." So that's when I became a trustee, and I served that term and was elected for a full term after that, and then became president of the congregation. I have served 2 terms as moderator. I have served many times, many meetings as parliamentarian, which is an unofficial position. Way back in the early days, I was computer committee chair and worked on software for the church. I was canvas chair once and was overshadowed only by John Parker, who achieved a 50% rise in pledges when he was canvas chair earlier. I was one of the leaders of a capital campaign, which was to raise money for the church roof, which we had neglected having money for that sort of thing. And when it was all over, I suggested to the board that we should put money aside every year to maintain the church building and grounds. They accepted that proposal and set up a committee. And we on the committee worked for a whole year working out the details, and a year later made our final proposal, which the board accepted, and that created the Property Maintenance and Improvement Fund. Allison and I have also taken on the project from other people of a bus trip to Niagara on the Lake every year, every May or June, to see a Shaw, a play in the Shaw Festival. General Assembly was in Rochester in 1998, and I have a little incident that amused me to tell you about that is to the credit of Dave Schwartz, who is listening. He was one of the volunteers who walked around holding a sign saying, "Ask me." Carl Titchener was the person who made the announcements every morning. And one of the announcements he made was a story he had been told that somebody asked Dave Schwartz, "When did Genghis Khan die?" And that made the crowd erupt in laughter, as Libby Moore is doing right now, but you can't hear her. And when the laughter had died down, Carl finished the story saying, "Quick thinking Dave said, 'I'm sorry to hear it.'" Okay, travels. Well, that's not quite it about GA. That work of managing the tellers and ushers worked out well enough for me, so the planning committee invited me to continue, and the next year in Salt Lake City, and the next year in Nashville, Tennessee, and then in Cleveland, and then in Quebec City, and then in Boston. So 6 GAs I attended in succession before I quit. Actually, I quit in Quebec City, but was persuaded by the planning committee to do Boston after that because that was the big one and they didn't want somebody new there. Travels. I've already told you about, or did I? 2 6-week camping trips that we took with the kids. One 6-week camping trip to national parks in the Southwest, and a year or 2 or 3 later, another to national parks in the Northwest. We went with Allison's parents on a couple of weeks driving in England from London to Edinburgh. We'd been on a birding elder hostel in Florida and another island hopping Rhodes Scholar in Georgia. 2 weeks back in England with Joyce Gilbert on one of her tours, England and Wales. 2001, a 3-week tour of India on the occasion of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the founding of Coady School. That was fun for me. I'm not sure it was much fun for Allison. 2-week tour of Hawaii, an Alaska cruise with my brother and sister, and a Rhodes Scholar train and ferry trip across Canada. We now live in St. John's Meadows, which is a retirement community off Elmwood Avenue. And my main volunteer activity here is to compile a resident directory, which has names and addresses and phone numbers and emails and so on of all the residents here, and a lot of more information, text information about the community. And every now and then, it's a 44-page booklet, which I print 540 copies on St. John's printers, of course, from time to time. So that's my story.
And you're sticking by it.